Hello and welcome to another video in our series of recordings of Reading Room Conversations. We're here in the Reading Room of LSE Library. My name's Indy Buller and I work here as one of the curators. And the basic premise behind these conversations is that we talk to researchers, people who've used the Reading Room, and we get to sit down with them and talk about some of the archives and special collections that they've used in the course of their research and take a closer look at some of those primary sources, some of those documents. Helping me do that today is Dr Freddy Foks. So thanks for joining us. Freddy is a historian and he's based at King's College, Cambridge and the University of Manchester. His focus is on modern Britain from the 1800s onwards, with a particular focus on the British Empire in the 19th and 20th centuries. His first book, which is due out in February next year, 2023, is called Participant Observers, and it will be published by the University of California Press. So welcome, Freddie, and congratulations on the imminent publication of the book. Clearly, it focuses on British social anthropology, and we're here in the library of the LSE. There's a kind of very close connection between anthropology as a field of study and the London School of Economics as an institution. Would you like to say a little bit more about the book?
Yeah, thanks so much, Indy. It's great to be back here. I spent many happy hours on these desks looking through these files. So the book tells two main stories. The first story is an imperial story. It tells about how social anthropology grew up from a kind of small discipline to quite a large one, especially at the LSE. Through colonial patronage and American funding, and follows all the anthropologists out to the empire and follows them and looks at their field research and their connections to imperialism. That story is relatively well known, although I try to give a bit of a new spin on it. The second story that I tell maybe is less well known, which is the impact of anthropology on Britain's intellectual culture, as you put it. So how people in Britain read and interpret anthropology, and read anthropology to reimagine Britain itself. And one of the ways that people did that was by deciding to do anthropological fieldwork in Britain, not that far away from where we're sitting now, in South London.
I mentioned at the start there that LSE has a close connection with the study of anthropology, and you make reference to that in your book, almost inevitably. Probably the most well-known name from the various figures that are included in that discussion is that of Bronislaw Malinowski, and LSE Library holds the papers of Malinowski. Would you like to describe, for those unfamiliar with him, what his role was in terms of like the formation of social anthropology? So
Malinowski's kind of seen as this really important founding figure for the discipline. And the reason really why he's seen as the founding figure is because he's the most famous proponent of the fieldwork method and of participant observation, which gives you the title of my book, Participant Observers. So the idea was that Malinowski went and studied people in situ. So rather than sitting at a desk and reading lots of reports about those people, he said that you had to actually go and live amongst them, engage with their culture, observe what they were doing, maybe even join in some of the things that they were doing. He famously went off on a canoe and went off on voyages, and then wrote about them afterwards.
Seems like quite an obvious idea, but he was a kind of pioneer in that method.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it seems obvious to us now, partly because he's been so influential. Because that's what anthropologists do. But up until the 1920s, it was a perfectly respectable way to be an anthropologist, was to sit in a room very much like this, looking at objects and organising them and cataloguing them and reading letters and reports. But it was really after the 1920s that to be a professional anthropologist, you had to actually go and observe people. And as you say, that's become commonplace. But as my book suggests, that's partly because he was so successful and his students.
So to come on to the first set of documents, first set of items from the archive, we're looking at some of the materials that relate to the topic of colonialism, which I think is quite a fairly large topic, and obviously, but also kind of quite a key topic in your book. And I think you describe it as a key stepping stone for anthropology as a sort of topic of study to come of age. And it's something you obviously draw attention to in the book. And we've got some material from, I think, one of Malinowski's classes, and where he's lecturing about sort of he said it kind of in the archive catalogue. It says it's lecturing about kind of magic and those topics, but you've picked some out which focus on land tenure and.
Yeah, so I mean, this is kind of seeing how the sausage gets made of history, I guess. That you open up a file expecting to see one thing and you find something else. And this was a really nice. The reason why I picked this file is because it was a kind of aha moment for me. I've been thinking that the anthropologists I was studying were interested in these questions of land tenure in Eastern Africa, and that they seem to be connected in Britain with people who are connected with what was called the League of Nations, which was this international organisation started after the First World War, supposedly in pursuit of kind of peace around the world, but also it had this move towards kind of colonial trusteeship, which was a way to hold German and former Ottoman holdings kind of under the jurisdiction of the League of Nations. So as you can see here, it says Mandates Commission, which is one of the parts of the League of Nations, and a crucial job that the Mandates Commission did was to look at questions of land tenure. Who had land tenure? Were European settlers pushing out, say, African peoples from the land which they traditionally farmed? And here again, you've got in purple land question, rights and legal basis. So
tenure is the idea behind the kind of rights over that
rights
land.
over that land. Who gets to farm it? Who should it be? European farmers? Should it be Africans themselves? And Malinowski, for all that he was involved in supporting colonial rule, which he was, I argue in the book through documents like this and other documentary evidence that he's supporting a particular view of colonial rule, which is what here is underlined indirect rule. So that's under here through the chief, new ideas through him, and that colonised people should have rights over the land. European settlers shouldn't be able to push them off the land. But this is nevertheless still a colonial ideology, and it's a form of colonial rule. But it's in competition with this kind of white settler idea in Eastern Africa, famously in Southern Africa, famously in Kenya.
Interesting. We've got a letter as well that he wrote to a chap called Alfred Zimmerman, and I think you've picked that out again because it's quite an interesting item. So again, we've got that here. If you want to read it out a little bit or describe.
Yeah, so this kind of carries forward this argument that I'm making about Malinowski's close connection to the League of Nations. So the League of Nations, on the one hand, is to do with kind of colonial administration and this idea of indirect rule, that colonised people should have some kind of rights over the land and ownership. And Malinowski is invested in that kind of ideologically, and he also thinks that he should go and speak in Geneva, which he's been invited to speak in Geneva, which is the headquarters of the League of Nations. Malinowski famously is a man who is always after the next buck, and always on at his publishers for more money and better royalties. And he says to Zimmern here in this letter from January 1930, that he's turning down an offer of a lecture in Ohio in America. They've offered him $3,500 to come there. But he says that he attends the brackets spiritually far more important engagement at Geneva. So he's kind of poking fun slightly at Zimmern here for not really offering him much money at all to come. But it gives you a sense of his priorities, really. Here's a man who is trying to live a kind of aristocratic lifestyle still in the 1930s, has very expensive outgoings, but is turning down a very lucrative offer to speak for his political investment in this idea of the League of Nations, in this idea of international trusteeship. So I think that this is a really kind of key document, at least in my view, for showing the importance he attached to that politics and to that institution as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, as you said, it's quite interesting just seeing that figure and the amount of money that he's been offered to kind of speak in Ohio, and how he's turned that down. It makes it very clear that he's turning it down. But he is quite this is dated 1930. He's a very well-known figure, isn't he, by this stage?
Yeah, by this stage, he's become a hugely important figure within anthropology, also internationally, and because of his connections to the League of Nations, to colonial administrators. He's becoming a kind of public figure as well. He is writing books for a kind of highbrow audience within Britain, trying to publish them at relatively cheap cost so that more people will read them. Again, it comes back to this kind of business-mindedness, but also his sense that he wants to really engage with and change the public conversation about culture, about colonialism, about all kinds of different topics, some of which I think we're going to talk about later.
Yeah, indeed. And again, something that kind of is I should explain in the library. Currently, we've got an exhibition which is all focuses on Malinowski and his time at the LSE and the school, and we're going to talk a little bit later about his seminar and the work he did actually teaching students and things like that. But it's quite interesting, given what you've said about his kind of antipathy to direct rule, that a lot of the makeup of his seminars, or certainly, a kind of significant proportion, are students from the empire who come to study under him at the LSE.
Yeah, it's a really important and maybe surprising thing about Malinowski's seminar is how cosmopolitan it is, how it's a space for people with very different views about the British Empire and the administration of it to come together and talk about policy. And there's been some really important work by historians like Mark Matera and others to especially focus on Malinowski's African students and their contribution to the seminar, and how, because he's invested in a particular view of indirect rule, there's a kind of opening for questioning about the whole policy of imperialism, especially in Africa. So there's a kind of complex relationship between Malinowski, the LSE, colonialism, and then how people can run with some of his ideas and take them into what at the time were very radical political positions.
Yeah, we'll definitely come on to a little bit more about some of those figures and names as we go on. You mentioned there his seminar, and Malinowski's kind of seminar and the work he did to kind of train his students and the next generation of anthropologists. And we've got an item here from an example from one of his seminars, which is kind of very discursive, and the kind of ideas were kind of open for discussion and debate. And one of the items you picked out is from it. If you want to describe it.
Yeah. So this is headed Colonial Administration Class Discussion on Miss Perham's paper, May the 9th, 1933. And when you're doing historical research like this, you've got to be a bit of a detective. I had to go into Marjorie Perham's papers in Oxford to try and find the original typescript of the seminar paper that they were discussing, and I try and compare and contrast that with what they talk about. I mean, it's also just striking, before talking about the content, that this even exists. Mm-hmm. Someone must have been typing this up. Was there a secretary there? Was there a typist? Was it reported speech? I mean, it reads a bit like a transcript, like a play or a film or something, and it dramatizes lots of distinctions being made about the role of anthropology in empire. So Marjorie Perham is a hugely important figure. By the early 1930s, she's a really key expert on administration in Africa, and she is a member of Malinowski's seminar and becomes one of his kind of great champions with the Colonial Office, and really lobbies hard for the role of anthropology in empire. So there are just a couple of moments in this back and forth dialogue. As you say, it's very free-floating. There are administrators, there are young students, and there's Malinowski himself, BM, who's in there, who you get to hear the voice of the seminar leader. So
by administrators, we mean colonial
administrators, yeah. And some of them aren't named, some of them are named. But it's this public-facing aspect of the seminar which is what makes it exciting for students to attend. If you're invested in colonialism or in fighting it, Malinowski's seminar is pretty much the only place in the UK where you get administrators, students, social scientists all sitting down and debating the most important issues of the day. One of those people is Hilda Beamer, who becomes later in life Hilda Cooper, who's a hugely important South African anthropologist. But here she is, I can't remember exactly how old she is in 33, but I think she's in her early 20s. She's come to the LSE to study. And there's an ongoing discussion going on. Should anthropologists be experts who really speak truth to power? Should they be heavily involved in what the administrators want to do and tell them that this is the right or the wrong course? Or as Beamer thinks, as Hilda Beamer puts it, a government anthropologist is an anomaly. And this is a relationship between social science and government or administration that continues to this day. I mean, this is still a really live debate. How close to the government should academics and social scientists be? And for Beamer, at the bottom of this page, you can see she's pretty wary. She wants to draw a line between what the administration do, what the government is doing, and what anthropology is doing. And she thinks it's really important that a strong dividing line is brought up, which, as we'll see on the next page, is strongly contested by her teacher, Malinowski.
So Malinowski has a different perspective.
He has a very
that?
different perspective. Actually, it's on this page over here. So he says that it's futile and a sign of mental laziness if the man of science, interestingly gendered, given that so many of his interlocutors are women, pretends he can keep away from ethical questions, or that he should not state it when his scientific outlook contributes to the real welfare of humanity. So we were talking before about the LSE in the 1930s, and you'll see this approach to LSE academics thinking that their role, whether it's Beveridge or Lionel Robbins or Friedrich Hayek, any number of famous economists, social workers, administrators, thinking that their role is to step in and advise government. It goes back to the Webbs. And Malinowski is fully speaking from that tradition in this document.
But you've also, as we've mentioned, we've got some of the administrators in the class, and they have an interesting perspective as well, don't they?
Yeah, because I think it's very easy for historians and anthropologists to read what the anthropologists say, especially in this era, and because they're speaking up to their ability to influence policy, and they're saying we have all of this important things to say, you might be led to think that they have all of this influence over policy. I mean, it would be reasonable to suggest to think that. But when you read what the administrator, who's unnamed, says, here the administrator says, there is no antipathy between anthropologists and administration in West Africa, so presumably a West African administrator. But anthropology is not a body of absolutely certain knowledge. Hence, a government confronted with the opinion of anthropologists has no alternative but taking other matters into consideration as well. Expert opinions are not a final criterion in British government. And again, I think that you have this...
Where have we heard that before?
Yeah, exactly. You have this real tension between people who want to keep social science distant from government, people like Malinowski who want to intervene in and change government policy, and that's very much Perham's view as well. But then when you come to the government side, you have this wary relationship between what they see as their purview, their power, their expertise, and all of these anthropologists who are coming in and saying, well, we're the actual experts, you should be listening to us. This debate just carries on and on and on through the decades, and different anthropologists take different views over the following decades about this. But these are familiar debates, and they're crucial debates. Whether it's in COVID, whether it's dealing with inflation, whether it's tax rates. The questions of expertise and how far social science should lean in or lean out from administrative questions. I don't think it'll ever go away, but this era is where this relationship, in Britain at least, is really first beginning to emerge, and it's at the LSE that lots of social scientists here are beginning to pose the question of how much social science can do to transform government.
Absolutely. So we were talking there about Malinowski's seminars and one of the debates that kind of arose from it. It's a key element, isn't it, of Malinowski's story, his mythos perhaps at LSE are his seminars. They've become very famous, they're well known in and of themselves as kind of areas where all of these lots of different debates happen. And he taught a good number of people who went on to have notable careers, didn't they? And lives, whether in anthropology, politics, social policy, whatever else, and other fields. Do you want to talk a little bit about why you think seminars are something that people repeatedly do come back to? Is it something to do with perhaps the personalities and the arguments at play? Or?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely to do with the personalities. It's definitely a core part of how Malinowski influences the discipline. I mean, we started with this idea that field work seems like common sense now. Well, it's through his seminar that he propagates that method. So that's one thing, just from within the history of anthropology. Then there's the question of who some of these significant figures are. And there are two strands to that, really. One is almost all of the professors in the 1940s or 50s studied with Malinowski. The people who lead the discipline at Oxford, Cambridge, LSE, Durham, the list goes on and on and on. They all came through his seminar. And whether they fought with him or argued with him or disagreed with him, they all basically agreed that they should be doing field work, even though they might have disagreed with him theoretically. But I think in this next document, what we'll see is that his seminar attracted a much wider cast of character than just anthropologists. I already mentioned that it's a place where government administration gets talked about. And because the British Empire is the biggest empire in the world, there are people who want to come and study the British Empire in London, and the place you come to do that really is the LSE, and really Malinowski's seminar.
Yeah, and exactly as you say, we've got this series of documents, just a folder really full of his seminar attendees.
Yeah.
For his classes, and we've got some of the kind of names that perhaps you're kind of referring to here. Perhaps one of the most famous is Jomo Kenyatta.
Yeah, so this document I think is really fascinating because it mixes these two histories of anthropology together. You've got the names of one of the most important post-Malinowskian anthropologists in the UK, Maya Fortes, listed alongside the first president of independent Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta. You also got Islanda Robeson, activists fighting against racism around the world and who will end up struggling against the British Empire after the Second World War. Mixed in with anthropologists, and you can just, while we don't have transcripts from these seminars, unfortunately, we can use our imaginations to think about some of the conversations that must have gone on. I mean, purely in a kind of history geek way, it's fascinating that you've got where they lived. So you can go onto Google Maps and find out where Jomo Kenyatta is living in London in the late 1930s as a student, or if you're more of an anthropology geek, find out where Siegfried Nardale or Maya Fortes is living. I mean, they're just wonderfully rich documents, and also give you a sense of who does and doesn't have a telephone extension as well at the time. So they're obviously able to phone each other up. I don't know why having a telephone number is important. Maybe the university would phone them up if they were missing the seminar. I don't know.
We kind of move on to something a little bit, which shows perhaps the some of the work that was done by his students, or that Malinowski wanted his students to do. And it's called very simply on here charts.
Yeah.
And we've got this idea that the seminars are very discursive. There's lots of discussion happening in them, kind of free discussion and all sorts of different stuff. And then we've got an example of what Malinowski wanted his students to do in the field when they were out there. Do you want to talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that these documents, and this is a whole folder filled with slightly different but often just duplicates of this same chart, that kind of speaks to this tension between Malinowski's kind of seminar patriarch who wants to spur discussion, and as kind of archetypal authoritarian kind of didactic teacher. And the charts become the way by which he takes his fieldwork methods that he develops in the late 1910s and into the 20s and tries to operationalize them and teach them to students. And what he comes up with is this chart. And you can see on it a number of columns. Within a number of columns, they're broken down into numbers, which are kind of subsets. And the idea is that if you were to fill in your notebooks, you were observing LSE culture or any culture around the world, and you looked at how birth and childhood and resources and ownership and domestic training and folk tales that LSE students told themselves, you would have a complete picture of their culture. And this really connects to his functionalist method. And if you collected all this information, he thought you could build a total picture of a society, from the individuals all the way up to the culture as a whole. And you can sense the importance he attached to this, and how he thought that he was doing something very original and new by the fact that at the top of the document it says copyright B. Malinowski, because he's in effect a kind of intellectual entrepreneur. He's got his seminar, and there are other ways of doing anthropology in other institutes around London, but he thinks he's onto a winner with these charts, and so he wants to make sure that no one apart from him can reproduce his methods.
Very interesting. So the expectation was that the students would go out into the field, carry out their research, broadly thinking of under these headings.
Absolutely,
Of what they're researching
absolutely.
and
They'd be
writing.
trained in the seminar, and they would get funding via Malinowski, often from the Rockefeller Foundation, go out to the field and apply his ideas.
Interesting. Which leads us very neatly onto the next item, which is an example of one of his students out in the field. So this is a letter that he writes to one of his students in the field, Margaret Reed, who's a kind of well-known anthropologist and went on to have a kind of very well-regarded career in anthropology, I believe, afterwards, and her reply. And do you want to talk a little bit about the letter?
Yeah, so we've got this idea that Malinowski, by the early 30s, has come up with these culture charts, and he's training his students, and he's up for a freewheeling conversation, but when the rubber hits the road, he wants them to apply his method, because he's invested in building a school of anthropology and spreading what he thinks are the best ideas. So by early 1935, he's sending this letter out to Margaret Reed in the field, and he's saying that, you've written to me, please write to me more regularly. Some of my other students write to me very regularly, even more regularly than you. And he says that to almost all of his students. It's interesting. I'm sure that if we worked out who is and isn't writing to him regularly, he wants all of them to write to him more than they are. And he mentions that there's this new airmail service, which is these flying boats, which the British, I think it's British Imperial Airways or something like that, has run this flying boat service from England to South Africa, and it goes down the coast of East Africa, and they take mail with them. So before then, letters arrive pretty slowly, but he can get letters out and back on lightweight paper like this to his students within a matter of days or weeks. So he can get a really good sense of whether they're applying the lessons of his charts or not. And I think he ends with a comment about, are the charts helpful? How's your method going? Is it working? Do I need to modify them? Because his hope is that the seminar will become like a network. There'll be people back at the LSE working and training. There'll be people in the field, and all this paperwork will be going back and forth. And hopefully, reports will come in, and you can discuss them around the seminar table, so that the field work of the people in the field becomes the training for the next generation of field workers.
Yeah. So it kind of moves in like a circle. And
Exactly.
It's all very connected.
Exactly.
But we've got a letter, and whilst this isn't, I guess, a fieldwork report, it's kind of a letter in response to Malinowski's from Margaret herself, and it's kind of very different to that structured chart that he wants his students to fill in, isn't it? It's quite variable in terms of what's discussed.
Yeah, I think it's really telling. It's from about a month later, so we're at the 28th of February 1935, so almost exactly a month after Malinowski's written to Reed in the field, and she says that she feels rather like a stage anthropologist at the moment, typing in a grass shelter, complete with sun helmet and moisture pouring off back and front. So clearly, by then, there's this idea that Malinowski himself has done so much to promote, that the anthropologist is this person sitting at their typewriter on their own in the grass shelter. But the fact that they're sending letters back and forth to each other gives you a sense they're not maybe so isolated as the picture would suggest. They're in constant touch with each other. And what she's in touch with him about is that she's stuck on the side of the road, actually. Rather than in a grass shelter, she's stuck, her lorry's broken down. She's been working for 5 weeks in a mine where she hasn't really been able to work out what's going on.
2 nights in a lion-infested spot.
Yeah, she spent time in a lion-infested spot, and I think that if you talk to anthropologists now, they may go out with all of these ideas about what they want to find out. This is the same across all field researchers, but actually there's an amount of resistance from just the world, where your truck breaks down, you're in a lion-infested spot, you may be wanting to speak to people, but they might not want to speak to you. The letters are filled with the interrelationship between anthropologists, their expectations, and what they can actually talk to people about, and what people are willing to talk to them about. So she ends with saying, really, on this page, that she's collected some factual information, some statistical information, but what she has to do is actually go back and read through all her notes again, and maybe she'll make something out of the jumble of material. I mean, something that's so striking from that chart is just how much data Malinowski's asking his students to find out about economics, food, household structure. presumably they would be overloaded with notebooks after only a few days or weeks. So it's a kind of it's a kind of hopeless task in a way to talk about the totality of a whole culture. They still try and do it. Right. And in a way, it's what makes these files so rich, is that when you go and research in the anthropologist's files, they only write up a tiny proportion of what they research. Their notebooks are filled with details about life in what's now Zambia in the mid-1930s. So they're incredibly rich sources for finding out about the social history of the communities that they're studying at the time.
Interesting. So despite all of these difficulties, practical difficulties of actually going out to places and finding out all of this information, they do still attempt to gather as much as they can.
Absolutely. Yeah. And increasingly historians are looking at that information to write about the communities that anthropologists were studying, because often the detail that they go into can tell you a lot about village life in Zambia in the mid-1930s. Even if the anthropologists couldn't come up with the totality, they suddenly come up with a lot of material.
So we've talked a lot there about, Malinowski's students, and we've got an example. We had an example there of one of his students out in the field in Africa and studying. But we have some examples where Malinowski and a famous, notable successor of his wanted to kind of bring the discipline perhaps closer to home.
Raymond Firth, who is one of Malinowski's most important students and actually takes over his chair at the LSE in the late 1940s, sends his students out to Bermondsey in South London to study a block of flats at Guinness Trust buildings.
As a fieldwork
method. And they're a group, I think there are about 12 students, all a kind of ragtag bunch of grad students. It must have been quite an alarming sight for the residents, coming around, knocking on their doors, interviewing them, trying to work out who's related to whom. And I think that, as he was saying, when we think of anthropology, we think of a discipline that is to do with studying people in other countries, other cultures. But there's nothing stopping the Malinowskian field method from actually being done within Britain or within America or within Western Europe. And Firth really follows through on that insight in this Bermondsey study. And this document that I've pulled out is a kind of schematic chart. And the way that I read it, at least, is GBB, I imagine, is the Guinness Trust buildings. Bermondsey, obviously, is the area around, and then there's London, and then there's beyond. And what this seems to be is a sketch of a diagram of a series of relationships between an individual and parents and other family members. Because what Firth is trying to do is try to work out who people rely on in their family, and how families in, say, London are different from families in the South Pacific, in the Solomon Islands, which is where he's done his research. And what this shows is that rather than in an island community where you would imagine that people have a very dense connection of ties within the village or beyond to other villages around the island, at least in London in the late 1940s, people may have had relations within the building, may have had relations within the neighbourhood, but that people's family connections are far, far more dispersed in late 1940s UK rather than in the Solomon Islands. And this becomes a bit of a problem for community studies researchers. Some of them try to just focus on the innermost ring of connections and say that that's a community, but other researchers try to kind of push beyond the methodological limits and come up with new concepts in social science.
That's really interesting, yeah. So that, I think you mentioned where they're kind of trying to connect networks.
Yeah. Absolutely. So the kind of shorthand in 1950s sociology is community, really, in which all of these people are going out into London, into other parts of the UK, trying to find communities, and the way that they're thinking of communities is as face-to-face relationships of people within a bounded locale, let's say, so within a building or more likely within a neighbourhood. And Michael Young and Peter Wilmot's really famous Family and Kinship in East London does that for Bethnal Green, where they find all of these really close connections within a few streets in Bethnal Green. Actually, what they find when you look at their field notes is much more like this. Some people with very close kin, lots of people with kin within 2 to 3 miles, but if you're pushing a baby in a buggy, 2 to 3 miles might take an hour. So it might be actually something you just do on the weekend, or you see your aunts and uncles or cousins, once every few weeks. And some people don't have any family nearby at all. They're in Scotland or Ireland or from all around the British Empire. But the researcher who really, in my mind, pushes past all of these issues is Elizabeth Bott, who takes what Firth and Young and Wilmot see as the problems with their method and runs with it. And what she says is a community is less bounded to a locale than it is a network that can be spread across a very wide space. And when you look at the network of who knows who, you can begin to come up with a relational set of people who are important to each other. And in a key set of articles, and then in a book in the late 1950s, she really births the new field of social network studies. And she was an anthropology lecturer in the LSE in the, I think, late 1940s, early 1950s, and then she worked for the Tavistock Institute, and there are fascinating letters between Firth and her. What she sees as a problem from her research, because she doesn't have the rich Malinowskian total view of the community, she turns to her advantage, and what she gets instead is the network. And as we all know, with social networks now online, it's who you stay in touch with, regardless of where they are, that we now understand is a really key part of community. So that's where the social sciences, from one point of view, go next, and it's transformed our understanding of the world, really.
That's fascinating. Freddy, thank you so much for discussing all of this and taking the discussions, and we're kind of very different to where we started it. As we mentioned, Freddy's book is Participant Observers, and it is out in all good bookshops in February next year, 2023. It just leaves me to say, Freddy, thank you very much, and good luck with the book and everything.
Thanks so much, Indy.
No worries.